Las Vegas has never really believed in preserving its own history. Other cities protect their old buildings behind historic markers and preservation societies. Vegas just packs a crowd onto the sidewalk, counts down from 10, and blows the whole thing up, then builds something twice as big on the exact same dirt within a couple of years. So today, we're counting down 10 forgotten Las Vegas casinos that vanished without a trace. Number 10, El Rancho Vegas. Before there was a strip, there was just a stretch of Highway 91 outside city limits, where a California hotel operator named Thomas Hull noticed drivers heading to Hoover Dam kept stopping to stretch their legs. Hull opened El Rancho Vegas on April 3, 1941, and it became, quite literally, the very first resort on what would become the Las Vegas Strip. With a Spanish-style exterior, a cowboy-themed interior, low-rise bungalows, and a genuine full resort experience, horseback riding, a swimming pool, and an opera house showroom, El Rancho set the template every single strip resort that followed would eventually copy. Hull deliberately chose that specific stretch of highway because it sat just outside Las Vegas city limits in unincorporated Clark County, where gambling regulations were considerably looser and land was far cheaper than anything available downtown. It turned out to be one of the most consequential real estate decisions in American entertainment history. Within a decade of El Rancho's opening, the Last Frontier, the Flamingo, the Thunderbird, and the Desert Inn had all followed his lead, building along that same stretch of highway rather than competing with the already established casinos of Fremont Street. Every single implosion covered later in this video happened on land that only became the Las Vegas Strip because Thomas Hull decided to build a ranch-themed motel there in 1941. For nearly 2 decades, El Rancho hosted A-list performers like Sammy Davis Jr., Dean Martin, and Lena Horne, and even played host to Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward's 1958 wedding. Then, in the early morning hours of June 17, 1960, a fire broke out backstage at the Opera House Theater while Harry James and Betty Grable were performing a late show, and within about an hour, the entire complex had burned to the ground. The blaze was ruled arson, but despite an extensive investigation, the case was never solved and nobody was ever charged. Owner Belden Cattleman vowed to rebuild. He never did. The site sat vacant for years afterward, an oddly quiet fate for the resort that started the entire Las Vegas Strip in the first place. Eyewitness accounts from that night describe a scene of genuine chaos and heartbreak. 2 Clark County Sheriff's detectives making their rounds first noticed smoke before flames had even become visible, and by the time fire crews arrived, the blaze was already consuming the resort's distinctive windmill tower. One survivor later recalled watching his own father, a hardened Las Vegas veteran, break down in tears as the tower folded and collapsed, saying it was the only time in his life he'd ever seen the man cry. Performers Pearl Bailey, Phil Ford, and Mata Hines reportedly survived a car accident of their own while fleeing the scene amid the confusion. Theories about who actually set the fire ranged from insurance fraud to mob rivalry, but more than 6 decades later, the arson that ended Las Vegas's very first strip resort remains officially unsolved. Number 9, Castaways. The Castaways began its life humbly as a small motel called the Sans Souci Auto Court back in the 1930s, before growing into the Sans Souci Hotel through the 1950s, and finally rebranding as the Polynesian-themed Castaways Hotel and Casino in 1963. Its signature feature was a bar built around a 1,500-gallon aquarium, a genuinely unusual touch for a strip property still finding its identity in the early 1960s. The casino portion of the business actually struggled badly in its early years, closing entirely in December of 1964, barely 14 months after its grand opening, before reopening under new management in 1967, a rocky start that foreshadowed the identity crisis the property would keep wrestling with for the rest of its existence. Howard Hughes, in the middle of his famous Las Vegas buying spree, purchased the Castaways in 1967 for roughly $3 million, folding it into his growing portfolio alongside the Landmark, the Sands, and several other properties covered in this very video. The Castaways limped along under corporate ownership through the 1970s and 80s without ever quite finding a niche distinct enough to compete with flashier neighbors, and by 1986, Steve Wynn had purchased the property along with adjacent vacant land for roughly $50 million. The Castaways closed for good on July 20th, 1987. Its final 228 rooms and 650 employees quietly let go. 2 years later, Wynn's new mega resort, the Mirage, opened on the exact same footprint, ushering in an entirely new era of Las Vegas that the modest, aquarium-adjacent Castaways had never quite managed to be part of. Longtime patrons who spent their evenings at the Castaways during its final years remember it fondly, if not exactly glowingly. One regular who visited regularly in the mid-1980s later described the place bluntly as a dump, but added that it was the kind of dump he genuinely loved hanging out in, comparing the affection to an old pair of shoes or a cheap can of beer. That kind of scruffy, unpretentious charm was exactly what the Mirage's opening made permanently obsolete. Wynn's new resort ushered in an era of 4,000-room mega properties, celebrity chef restaurants, and elaborate theatrical productions, a version of Las Vegas built for spectacle first and gambling second, leaving very little room for a modest Polynesian-themed casino built around a fish tank. Number 8. The Dunes. The Dunes opened on May 23, 1955, with an exotic Arabian Nights theme that immediately set it apart, complete with a massive sultan figure perched on the roof greeting guests from above the strip. The New York Times grouped it among the class of 1955, alongside the Riviera, as Vegas's building boom accelerated through the mid-1950s. A 30-story addition in 1965, nicknamed the Diamond of the Dunes, briefly made it one of the tallest buildings on the entire strip. Decades of financial struggles and mob-adjacent ownership eventually caught up with the property. Japanese investor Masao Nangaku bought the Dunes in 1987 for $157 million, but a lengthy gaming control board investigation stalled his renovation plans entirely. Steve Wynn's Mirage Resorts bought the property in November of 1992 for just $75 million, and the Dunes closed its doors on January 26, 1993. On October 27, 1993, Wynn imploded the Dunes' North Tower in a televised spectacle complete with fireworks and a staged pirate battle at nearby Treasure Island, drawing roughly 200,000 spectators and becoming the first major implosion in Las Vegas history. The South Tower followed quietly the next July. Wynn's $1.6 billion Bellagio eventually rose on the site in 1998, its famous dancing fountains now performing on the exact spot where the Dunes casino floor once stood. The Dunes implosion set a precedent the entire city would spend the following 2 decades enthusiastically imitating. Clark County's fire marshal at the time, Don Fitzgerald, had initially worried that simply wrecking balling the 235-foot North Tower could take up to 6 months and snarl strip traffic the entire time, which is exactly what pushed officials toward the more dramatic, faster option of explosives instead. Public notices ahead of the event warned residents to expect loud noise, bright flashes, smoke, and heavy dust, a fairly modest description for what became a genuine citywide spectacle. Once Las Vegas discovered that blowing up its own history could double as a publicity stunt for whatever billion-dollar resort was replacing it, the implosion became less a demolition method and more a permanent piece of the city's marketing playbook. Number 7. The Landmark. Groundbreaking on the Landmark began in 1961, envisioned as a genuinely futuristic master-planned resort with a Space Needle-style observation tower at its center. It didn't go smoothly. Original owner Frank Carroll ran out of money partway through construction, and the project sat unfinished for years, wallowing in debt, multiple bankruptcies, and ownership changes before finally opening on July 1, 1969, more than 8 years after breaking ground. Howard Hughes bought the property just 6 months before it finally opened, adding it to his sprawling Las Vegas collection, and the tower's uppermost floors reportedly served as one of his private residences. Despite hosting entertainers like Danny Thomas and appearing in films including Diamonds Are Forever and Viva Las Vegas, The landmark lost money virtually every year of its existence. It closed on August 8, 1990, and sat empty for years until the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Authority purchased it in 1993, specifically to demolish it for parking and convention space. On November 7, 1995, the 356-foot tower, the tallest reinforced concrete building ever imploded in North America at the time, came crashing down in a 13-second implosion. The footage would go on to have an unexpectedly long afterlife, appearing the following year in Tim Burton's film Mars Attacks, where the landmark's destruction was reused to depict Martians leveling the building. It remains, quite possibly, the most watched Las Vegas casino implosion in history, and almost nobody watching it in theaters realized it was real footage of a real, financially doomed hotel. Local historian Nolan Dalla described the landmark's entire existence in fittingly blunt terms, noting that it seemed to hold all the cards on paper, a striking, futuristic tower in a city built on gambling metaphors, yet was dealt one losing hand after another until it finally folded for good. Design flaws, building code violations, internal scandals, and what Dalla simply called plain old bad luck combined to make the tower a financial sinkhole from the moment it broke ground in 1961 straight through to its final implosion 34 years later. Today, all that physically remains is a vintage 1960s-era neon landmark sign, standing less like a monument and, in Dalla's own words, more like a tombstone for the tower that once towered over it. Number 6. The Sands. Built by Texas gambler Jake Friedman for $5.5 million, the Sands opened on December 15, 1952, and became, within just a few years, the single most legendary address in American entertainment. The Copa Room, its 400-seat showroom, hosted Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Joey Bishop, and Peter Lawford in what became known as the Summit at the Sands, effectively the birthplace of the Rat Pack. The original Ocean's 11 was filmed there in 1960, cementing the Sands as the physical embodiment of everything glamorous about mid-century Las Vegas. Howard Hughes bought the Sands in 1967 for $14.6 million, part of his broader effort to push organized crime influence out of Nevada casinos, though longtime maitre d' Levin later lamented that the hotel lost much of its glamour under corporate ownership. After passing through several more owners, Sheldon Adelson's group took control in 1989, eventually adding the massive Sands Expo Convention Center in 1990. The hotel itself closed on June 30, 1996, and was imploded before a cheering crowd on November 26, 1996, clearing the way for Adelson's new Venetian resort. One detail survived, though. The Sands Expo Convention Center, built as a structurally separate building, wasn't touched by the implosion, and still operates today under a new name, making it the last physical piece of the Sands still standing. At the moment of the implosion itself, at 2:05 in the morning, a crowd gathered along the strip cheered with what one reporter described as raucous energy usually reserved for people who'd had one too many drinks. Within seconds, 17 stories of Rat Pack history collapsed into a pile of dust and rubble. Levin, who'd spent 17 years watching over the Copa Room until the very end, later reflected on just how far the property had drifted from its glory days, telling an interviewer flatly that he wouldn't give you 2 cents for Vegas today compared to the version of the city he remembered from the Sinatra era. It's a sentiment that, fairly or not, seems to echo through nearly every implosion on this entire list. Number 5. The Hacienda. Opening in 1956 at the far southern end of the Strip, the Hacienda started life as a modest 256-room motor lodge and steadily grew into a full 1,200-room resort over the following decades. It never quite achieved the same star power or mob mythology as its northern neighbors, carving out a reputation instead as a comfortable, reliably profitable, family-friendly property. Its location, well south of the main casino cluster, also made it something of an unofficial gateway resort, often the very first hotel travelers driving in from Los Angeles or Southern California would pass on their way into town, giving it a modest but genuinely loyal following among road-tripping visitors long before anyone had heard the term drive market applied to Las Vegas tourism. The Hacienda's ending came with a genuinely theatrical flourish. Imploded on New Year's Eve of 1996, its destruction was deliberately synchronized with the city's New Year's fireworks celebration, giving Las Vegas a double spectacle to ring in 1997. One show celebrating the calendar, and one show erasing a 40-year-old hotel to make room for what would eventually become Mandalay Bay. The Hacienda's horse and rider neon sign became genuinely historic in its own right, serving as the very first restored sign installed when the Neon Museum officially opened its outdoor neon boneyard gallery, giving the Hacienda the strange distinction of being simultaneously demolished and immortalized in the same era. The Hacienda's steady, unglamorous reliability actually made it something of an anomaly on the Strip, a resort that survived 4 decades without ever becoming the backdrop for a mob scandal, a Rat Pack legend, or a Hollywood film franchise. It simply worked, quietly and profitably, serving budget-conscious families and value-seeking tourists while flashier neighbors chased headlines. That kind of understated success rarely earns a casino a place in Las Vegas folklore, which is probably why the Hacienda's implosion, despite its perfectly timed fireworks, tends to get less attention today than nearly every other property on this list. Sometimes the quietest resorts get the quietest send-offs, even when the actual demolition comes with genuine pyrotechnics attached. Number 4. The Aladdin. The Aladdin's Arabian Nights theme first opened under that name on March 31st, 1966, though the property had cycled through earlier identities as the Tally-Ho Hotel and King's Crown Hotel before finding its footing. Its Aladdin Theater for the Performing Arts hosted major touring acts, and on May 1st, 1967, it became the site of one of the most famous celebrity weddings in Las Vegas history, when Elvis Presley married Priscilla Beaulieu there in a brief private ceremony. Financial instability shadowed the Aladdin for decades, including a 1989 bankruptcy filing. Developer Jack Summer purchased the aging 36-acre property in 1994 for roughly $80 million and announced plans for a full rebuild. The original tower closed on November 25, 1997, and was imploded on April 27, 1998, with then-Lieutenant Governor Lonnie Hammergren reading a banner hung near the rubble that declared, "Out of the dust, Aladdin rises anew." The new Aladdin opened in August of 2000, but the prophecy didn't hold for long. That version filed for bankruptcy within about a year, and by 2007, the property had been rebranded entirely as Planet Hollywood, which still operates on the site today. The original Aladdin's fiberglass genie lamp sculpture survives in storage at the Neon Museum, a strange little artifact from a wedding far more famous than the hotel that hosted it. The Aladdin's repeated cycle of collapse and reinvention makes it something of a cautionary tale, even among the other implosions on this list. Most Strip properties get imploded once and replaced by something built to last. The Aladdin managed to blow up, rebuild, and go bankrupt again within less than a decade, a pace of failure that even jaded Las Vegas developers found remarkable at the time. Part of the problem, according to longtime observers of the Strip's business side, was a rebuild that never quite settled on a clear identity of its own, caught somewhere between honoring its Arabian Nights legacy and chasing the theming trends other resorts had already claimed. Planet Hollywood's eventual 2007 rebrand finally gave the property a coherent identity again, though it came at the cost of erasing the Aladdin name from the Strip entirely. Number 3. The Stardust. Opening on July 2nd, 1958, and briefly billing itself as the world's largest resort hotel, the Stardust became Las Vegas's first genuine mass-market casino, luring crowds with cheap rooms and loss-leading food deals rather than pure glamour. Its 188-foot neon sign, made up of dozens of Googie-style stars, became one of the most recognizable pieces of signage in Las Vegas history. The Stardust's real legacy, though, is inseparable from organized crime. Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal ran the casino through the 1970s, while millions of dollars were secretly skimmed from its counting room and funneled to mob bosses in Kansas City, Chicago, and Milwaukee, one of the largest organized crime schemes in American gaming history. In October of 1982, a car bomb planted in Rosenthal's Cadillac in the Stardust's own parking lot nearly killed him. He survived only because a metal plate installed under the driver's seat shielded him from the blast. The bombing was never solved, and the entire saga became the direct inspiration for Martin Scorsese's 1995 film Casino, with Robert De Niro's character based closely on Rosenthal himself. The Boyd Group eventually purchased the Stardust legitimately in 1985, running it cleanly for another 2 decades before finally closing it on November 1st, 2006. It was imploded on March 13th, 2007. Its famous star-shaped sign now preserved at the Neon Museum, and Resorts World Las Vegas opened on the site in 2021. In a 2008 interview conducted from his home in Miami Beach, years after the skimming scandal had become public record and the subject of a hit film, Rosenthal remained defiant, flatly denying any knowledge of wrongdoing during his tenure and insisting no skimming occurred while he held responsibility for the property. A 1983 federal grand jury told a considerably different story, indicting 15 people in connection with a scheme to skim at least $1.6 million from the Stardust alone, and the Nevada Gaming Control Board ultimately banned Rosenthal from every casino in the state for life. Whatever the truth of his personal involvement, the implosion of the Stardust in 2007 effectively closed the book on an era when mob money and Las Vegas casino floors were, for decades, functionally inseparable. Number 2. The New Frontier. Opening as the Last Frontier on October 30th, 1942, this was the second resort ever built on the Strip, following El Rancho Vegas by just over a year. Renamed the New Frontier in 1955, with a shift toward a space-age aesthetic, the property earned its most enduring claim to fame on April 30th, 1956, when a young Elvis Presley made his very first Las Vegas appearance there. It didn't go well. One local reviewer at the time dismissed the 21-year-old singer as a bore for the typical Vegas crowd, and Presley wouldn't perform in the city again for another 13 years. Howard Hughes purchased the property in 1967, shortening its name simply to the Frontier, and it went on to host acts including Liberace and the final ever performance of Diana Ross with the Supremes on January 14, 1970. The resort also became the site of one of the longest labor strikes in American history, when culinary and bartenders union workers walked out for over 6 years in the 1990s. After closing permanently on July 16, 2007, the New Frontier was imploded on November 13, 2007, watched by thousands of onlookers. Unlike most of the sites on this list, nothing meaningful has ever been rebuilt there. Wynn Resorts bought the land in 2017 for $336 million, and as of this recording, the lot across from the Wynn and Encore resorts remains largely vacant, a strange, empty gap on a strip that almost never leaves land unused for long. The New Frontier's implosion notably lacked the same wave of public nostalgia that accompanied the Stardust, Sands, or Desert Inn demolitions in the years just before it. Coverage at the time pointed out that, for most modern tourists, the property had simply become just another cheap room on the Strip, disconnected from the deeper history locals still associated with it. That gap between the New Frontier's genuine historical significance, the second resort ever built on the Strip, Elvis's actual Vegas debut, and its diminished discount reputation by the mid-2000s, says something important about how quickly even the most historically significant Las Vegas properties can slide into irrelevance once they stop reinvesting in themselves. History alone has never been enough to keep a casino's doors open on the Strip. Number 1. The Riviera. Topping this list is the Riviera, which opened on April 20th, 1955, as the Strip's very first high-rise resort, a genuinely bold architectural statement at a time when most Las Vegas properties still sprawled outward in low-rise bungalows rather than reaching upward. Liberace headlined the Riviera's opening, reportedly earning an unprecedented $50,000 a week, and the resort went on to host entertainers ranging from Dean Martin to decades of subsequent headliners across a 60-year run. The Riviera's cultural footprint on film alone would justify a spot on this list. It served as a filming location for the original 1960 Ocean's 11, the 1971 James Bond film Diamonds Are Forever, and Martin Scorsese's Casino in 1995, giving it arguably the deepest big-screen legacy of any casino covered here. But 6 decades of operation eventually caught up with an aging, increasingly outdated property competing against mega-resorts built with budgets the Riviera's founders could never have imagined. The 2,075-room resort closed for good in May of 2015. The Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Authority bought the entire 26-acre property for $182.5 million, plus an additional $8.5 million in transaction costs, and spent $42 million clearing the 13-building site for a convention center expansion. The taller Monaco Tower came down first, in a celebrated implosion complete with fireworks and a public viewing area. The final piece, the Monte Carlo Tower, was imploded quietly 2 months later, with nearby residents simply told to stay indoors rather than gather to watch. After 60 years as one of the most photographed hotels on the entire Strip, the Riviera's ending arrived almost without ceremony at all. There's something genuinely fitting about the Riviera closing out this list, given that its 1955 opening as the Strip's first high-rise essentially set every other implosion on this countdown into motion. Before the Riviera proved a tower could work on the Strip, resorts sprawled outward in low bungalows the way El Rancho Vegas and the early Castaways once did. After it, height became the new arms race, eventually escalating all the way to the mega resorts that replaced nearly every property on this list. The Riviera didn't just live through 6 decades of Las Vegas history. In a very real sense, it kicked off the entire architectural competition that made all these later implosions inevitable in the first place. Why Vegas keeps doing this. Look across all 10 of these implosions, and a genuinely consistent pattern emerges. Nearly every single one of these casinos didn't fail because guests stopped showing up entirely. They failed because the land underneath them became worth more as a blank canvas for something newer than it was worth as an aging, increasingly outdated resort, still running the same formula from decades earlier. Wind tore down the Castaways and the Dunes, specifically to build the Mirage and the Bellagio. Adelson tore down the Sands specifically to build the Venetian. The pattern repeats so consistently across 60 years of Strip history that it's practically the city's actual business model, rather than an occasional exception to it. There's also a financial logic underneath all of this that rarely gets discussed alongside the fireworks and the crowds. Land along the Las Vegas Strip has become so extraordinarily valuable that, past a certain point, an aging, mid-sized casino generating modest annual revenue simply cannot compete with the theoretical value of a brand new mega resort built on the exact same footprint. Once that math tips far enough in one direction, demolition isn't really a last resort. It's simply the most profitable next move available, regardless of how much star power or cinematic history happens to be sitting on the land at the time. That's a genuinely unsentimental way to think about places that hosted Elvis's wedding and the Rat Pack's biggest nights, but it's also, by most accounts, exactly how Las Vegas developers have approached the Strip for the better part of 7 decades. There's also something genuinely unique to Las Vegas in how openly, even gleefully, the city celebrates its own demolitions. Most cities treat the loss of a historic building as a quiet tragedy. Las Vegas sells tickets, hires fireworks crews, and turns the whole thing into appointment television. That's arguably the most honest thing about this entire list. Nowhere else in America tears down its own history with quite this much showmanship, and nowhere else has turned forgetting the past into such a genuinely spectacular form of entertainment in its own right. If you enjoyed this look back at the Las Vegas casino's history left behind, give this video a like and subscribe for more deep dives into the places that used to define an entire era before the wrecking ball, or in this case, the dynamite, came for them.